Welcome. We're just going to give it a minute or so to see if we get a few more people arriving, and then we'll begin.
Lucy, if you don't mind, I'm going to paste some OATP links into the chat so everybody.
Yeah, that would be great. Please do.
Okay.
We're getting a couple more people. Give it another minute and then I will kick off. Okay, I think we'll get started, and then if more people join, then that's great. So hello everyone, and welcome to this Open Access Books Network event about the Open Access Tracking Project. Before we get started, just to say that this event is being recorded, so if you prefer not to be in the recording, then keep your camera off and your mic on mute. And please feel free to drop any questions you might have in the chat box as we go. So on the call today, my name is Lucy Barnes, and I'm speaking with Peter Suber, who's the director of the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication and the Harvard Open Access Project. He's also senior researcher at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Also on the call is Milica Shevkusic, who's the librarian at the Institute of Technical Sciences of the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Belgrade. She's also a member of the repository development team at the University of Belgrade Computer Center, and she's the IFL Open Access country coordinator in Serbia. And also on the call is Gary Price, who is a librarian, a writer, and a consultant based in the Washington, DC metro area. And he runs infoDOCKET and the Association of Research Libraries Day in Review. And we're here to talk about the Open Access Tracking Project. But I think rather than my introducing it, I'll hand over briefly to Peter and to Milica and Gary to say a few words about the project and about their involvement with it. So Peter, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Lucy. I want to thank you for setting up the session today, and also for inviting Gary and Milica. I very rarely get to see my taggers face to face, and I've never met Milica at all, which is a good example of how a crowdsourced project works. Basically, Open Access Tracking Project is a way to keep track of everything that's going on with open access, or everything that has gone on, past and present. It's a social tagging project. That means that if you visit a page that's related to open access and you want to bring it to the attention of other people or share it more widely, you pull up our tool and you apply relevant tags. For example, if it's new, you use our tag for new things. If it's about open access books, you use our tag for open access books. If it's about copyright, you use our tag for copyright. If it's in the field of anthropology, you use our tag for that. We have tags by country, by academic discipline, by language, and then by open access subtopics, like books, copyright, policies, events, and so on. And if you tag it that way, especially if you use the tag for new items, then it is pushed in a feed to everybody who subscribes to our feed of new things. Our primary feed consists of everything new, noticed and tagged by our army of taggers. We have secondary tags for things that are not necessarily new, but if you only care about open access, say in anthropology, you can subscribe to the feed for our tag for anthropology, and you can get everything tagged with that, whether or not it's new. Tags can be applied to new items, and then we use the new tag. They can be applied to old items and simply omit the new tag. And so we tag retroactively to try to capture everything that's ever been said about open access, or all developments from the past and present about open access. It's a way to comprehend the field and organize knowledge of the field by subtopic or by tag as we go. But a side effect of tagging things is that we send off or publish these real-time alerts to people who choose to follow the progress of open access. Starting in 2009, it was the most comprehensive source of open access news, and it's still the most comprehensive source today, and it's more comprehensive than it ever was. There are ways to reduce the volume if you want to. Maybe we can get into that later, but by default, it's voluminous because there's a lot going on. And it's useful because you want to know what's going on, or many of us want to know what's going on, and at the same time, we want to organize it, be able to find things that we remember reading, or everything on a certain subtopic. For example, I'll often be reading a blog post about something like an open license, and somebody says, where can I find a good discussion about this? And instead of having to hunt through my memory for the best articles that I've seen on it, I can simply pull up the URL for all the items tagged with a certain tag and paste that into the discussion. So one link points to a living, dynamic bibliography on that particular subtopic, updated in real time by our crowd of taggers. Users can subscribe to the feed of new things. They can subscribe to the feed on any subtopic. They can also subscribe to what we call a remix feed, which is a Boolean combination of any other feeds. So if you really care about nothing but open access in anthropology in the French language, then you can do that by taking our tag for anthropology and our tag for French and looking for the Boolean conjunction of those two. Maybe I'll stop there, except to say we need taggers. And because we want to tag everything that's new and old, we want to tag in every academic field and every country and every language and every subtopic. We want people who care about different academic fields, different countries, different languages, different subtopics. And the more we get, the more eyeballs who are scanning for new news and comment about open access, the more comprehensive we'll be.
That's great, thank you. So that's perhaps a good segue then to Melitza and Gary to talk a little bit about how you became involved with the OATP and why. Melitza, would you like to go first?
Okay. Well, I'm probably one of the most recent taggers because I joined only last year. I met Nancy Pontica, whom I know through CORE, because I'm a CORE ambassador as well, because I'm very much involved in with repositories, and she had a presentation at the Open Science Fair in Porto, a 20-minute presentation of the project, and I was aware of the project for some time, mostly through emails that I got through AFL. And that was something that was labeled red in my inbox, but somehow I didn't have time to join or to consider it in greater detail. And then after Nancy's presentation, I said, well, that's the moment. Now is the moment I will join now. And I promised this to Nancy, that the first thing I do when I come home will be to contact the team and Peter and to join the project. And at that moment when she was explaining, my initial idea was to tag items mostly in Serbian and Balkan languages, Slavic Balkan languages, because, you know, if you know Serbian, you know 3 other languages as well, because they're linguistically the same, but politically different. And also I learned Russian in primary school. I can read Italian, French. I can understand some Polish and Czech. So it's okay. You use Google Translate, and basically you can tag these items too. So my idea was to join as a tagger for those exotic languages that are not very well represented. But eventually I ended up tagging mostly in English because there are not so many news in those languages. I try to cover them when I find some, but in most cases these are translations of some news posts in English. So I don't tag these items if they are merely translations, but only the new items. I'm doing this in a bit old-fashioned way. I'm not using, it's interesting, I was briefly involved with Site You Like, and I've never really liked those other tagging things, and I didn't see much use of them. But this was actually interesting for me as a searchable database, as a big project, and I also understand the importance of tagging the old things, and I have some of them waiting for me to tag them, because I use the database very often in my research when I have to start writing something on a rather new topic for me, and to check what has been published previously. And also, it's a good way to get an idea of how things developed. For example, research data management is something quite new for me. I started practicing this last year, and when I got involved with the topic, it was very useful for me to track the old news and pieces of information among the things tagged by taggers. So I see great potential in this, and I'll probably be more seriously involved in this for some longer time. I really like the project, and I will also try to encourage some of my local colleagues to join, because it's very important to, this is a very good resource, and it should, the multilingual dimension of it should be highlighted more. It should be strengthened.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I see it.
Thank you. And Gary, how about you? How did you get involved with the project? Are your sort of motivations similar to Melitza or different?
No, Peter, excuse me, Peter and I go back probably close to 20 years now. I have been running two other one at that point, now two different websites. And Peter and I had similar interests in how do you find out things before other people? How do you get to the news and resources before they disseminate out into the webosphere? And so we started talking back then, and then in recent years, Peter invited me to join the OATP because, you know, I'm already finding this type of material for the two websites that Lucy, you were nice enough to mention. I'll throw some links in the chat. But for infoDOCKET and now for the Association of Research Libraries Day in Review, I'm already finding this material. And as a librarian, I'm really in the business of getting this stuff to as many people as possible, at least in this particular situation. So since I'm already discovering this material, and while I post some of it on infoDOCKET and some of it on ARL Day in Review, as Peter said, for open access type of content, OATP is the most comprehensive. So we share, I try to tag as much as possible for OATP. I know Peter sees my sites and he grabs things that I don't get to add to OATP. But, you know, Peter has been a friend and a huge supporter of my work from literally day one. And when Peter asked me to be part of this, it's my honor, really.
It's really interesting that you're sort of talking about both the sort of historical reach of the tracking project, and then also its kind of very current nature, that it sort of has both of those facets to it. I was wondering about the sort of strengths of the OATP, and I suppose perhaps that sort of approach to the chronology of the development of open access might be one of them, that it can perform both those functions of being a kind of record and a kind of news and new developments kind of alert system. I don't know what the three of you think about that. If there are other strengths that you might think of as well that are sort of sort of relevant.
Most people who know about OATP think of it as a tool for current awareness or for real-time alerts about what's new. But the history of OA or the tagging of older things is just as important to me. And some tags I consider to be retroactively comprehensive. That is, sometimes I'll introduce a new tag and I'll take pains to search for everything on that subject before I make it public, or at least before waiting too long. And then I actually label it as retroactively comprehensive, so that when you look at the tag library for that, you actually find all the items that we know about, or at least a reasonable approximation of all of them, right there. And in other cases, we're far from making tags retroactively comprehensive, and we're urging our crowd of taggers to help us do that. But one result of getting things into OATP is that they're searchable, and people doing research on open access can find them when they need them. And in almost every case, they find things they didn't realize existed. So I encourage people who are doing research on open access to tag older things as they go. The older the thing is, the more likely it is that we haven't tagged it yet. And the more researchers tag things, the more comprehensive the database gets, not just for real-time alerts, but for searching and research.
One of the things that I also do, not only with what I tag with OATP, but also what I do with infoDOCKET and ARL, is everything I link to, those underlying links, I Wayback Machine. I actually send, there's a feature in the Wayback Machine that most people don't know, and now you can actually do it in bulk. And if anybody's be interested in how that works, just drop me an email and I'll send you some information. But everything that I link to in AOTP or anywhere, when I discover that link, I send it to the Wayback. So now, if that link disappears or changes, what I saw at that particular moment in time, there is a copy of it in the Wayback Machine. And I think that's not only important for OATP, because I completely agree this OATP is an alerting service, but it's also a history of open access organized by a very important person in that world. And I think it's important that these links don't go away as things do on the internet very quickly.
That's interesting. Is that so? I was also interested in what you think the kind of weaknesses of the OATP are, and I suppose is that kind of archiving aspect a potential weakness, which it sounds like, Gary, you sort of thought of a way to try and mitigate that problem, that links may die or break, or things can vanish off the internet.
Yes, that is a potential weakness. Right now, a tag record in OATP uses the link that the tagger used when they found the item, and that might die in weeks. It certainly might die in years. What I want in a future version of OATP is either a link to a copy in the Wayback Machine or a copy in PermaCC, or both. And in both cases, it takes a little time to save work in the Wayback Machine or in PermaCC, and that time slows down tagging. And that's one reason we haven't incorporated that feature yet. But if I can get funding to develop the underlying software, then that's a feature I do want to add. And by the way, I should mention, the underlying software is open source. It's called Tag Team. We developed it specifically for OATP because other tagging platforms didn't have the features that we needed. Melissa mentioned Site You Like. That's just one example of another tagging platform. It's pretty good. And there were other good ones at the time, but none that had the features we wanted. So we're developing Tag Team to serve the purposes of OATP. And having preservation copies of everything we tag is one of our purposes, and it's on our list for future development.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I was wondering about is, if something is tagged inaccurately, is there a mechanism to report this or to correct it? Can it be retagged? I wonder if one of you could speak to that.
Sure. First of all, it's a crowdsourced project like Wikipedia, and if somebody tags an item in error, puts a tag that completely does not apply, then any other tagger can remove it. And that's my preferred remedy. Instead of reporting it to me and having me remove it, every tagger has the power to remove it themselves. And I encourage that. So in that sense, the result is like Wikipedia, in that it's the result of different editors making different contributions, including deletions. But what's much more common is for one tagger to add tags A, B, and C, but stop there, and for another tagger to say, oh, well, that person omitted D, E, and F, and then they add them. So that over time, different taggers noticing the same item add more and more relevant tags, so the item comes up in more and more relevant searches.
Mm-hmm.
I used to worry about that, as Peter knows. But that's exactly what I do. I put in as many tags as I think are relevant or accurate, and either Peter or another member of the project comes along and makes changes, adds, deletes, that type of thing. And I don't worry about it anymore.
Yeah.
I think the job I have, the way I look at it, is my role is to get it in there with some basic tagging and let others make changes if necessary.
And also other pieces of metadata can be checked. For example, if an abstract description is not very detailed, another tagger can add a more detailed description. And what I would also like to encourage taggers to do is to use PIDs, because for example, if you are tagging an item in Zenodo, the software picks up the URL, and I usually replace it with a DOI because it's persistent.
Mm-hmm.
So we should encourage taggers to search for PIDs, and also, well, I don't know who is the right address to send this message, but some of the websites are not well optimized for taggers, because the software picks up some metadata that is available, but if the website is not well optimized, for example, if the title is untitled or home, then this piece of information has to be added manually. So also some sort of training for those who maintain the academic websites and or the publishers' websites is a good idea, that they should enrich their metadata. There are some plugins that may be used to facilitate this process. So this should be considered.
It's interesting.
Linda is right that some sites are not well optimized for tagging. A good example is a bad blog. So if you're trying to tag a blog post, the title might be the blog itself rather than the title of the blog post. A well-run blog doesn't have that problem, but many blogs are not well-run. And when that happens, a human can correct it, but very often the human doesn't notice it. But I agree with Gary as well. It's important just to get it in there, because that means it's available for subsequent improvement if somebody has the time and somebody notices.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that what you're describing, the project itself is very collaborative, but the way of working on it, it sounds like it's quite disaggregated, that it tends to be people working individually. And I wondered, is there a kind of a social aspect to tagging, or is there a board somewhere where you can talk about these issues together, or some other platform where you can discuss them? Or is it more just kind of dispersed and people just kind of come across things and correct them as they go?
Right now, tagging is a fairly isolated activity. You tag something because you noticed it and you think it's worth sharing, and you apply the tags that you think are relevant. And then if you notice that something's already been tagged, you can decide whether it needs improvement and whether you have improvements to add. The project used to be grant funded. It's not anymore. It's a completely volunteer project. But when it was grant funded, I had some staffers to do some of the tagging for me, but also to do some testing of the software and other jobs. And I would discuss with my staff certain aspects of the controlled vocabulary. What tag should we use for such and such? Should we change the tag that we use now to something else? And that was the extent of the discussion, but it was valuable. And I don't want to be the only one who makes vocabulary decisions. OATP does support user-defined tags, and many of our now accepted or canonical tags are proposed or have been proposed by users. But I've been waiting to launch a discussion forum for our taggers so we can have these discussions more widely. Long ago, 10 years ago, I reserved the Google group OATP before somebody else grabbed it. But while I've reserved it, I haven't activated it. But I'm ready to activate it as soon as I think we have enough taggers to have a good discussion about the vocabulary. That would be the main purpose of the vocabulary, of the discussion group.
Mm-hmm. And Milica and Gary, do you have any like a perspective on that question? Would you welcome a place where you can discuss these sorts of issues, or is it more of a kind of solitary habit, a solitary activity?
Well, both. I like discussion, but I also like the solitary part of it, because we can tag whenever we have time, whenever we like, whatever we find interesting. And well, this is very similar to the Wikipedia experience to me. I'm also a Wikipedian, and that's very similar. And I like this dimension. You are never alone. You know that somebody will read what you've done, that someone will correct. There is a high probability, and that makes you feel safe, and that makes you feel not alone in the story, but you're free to do the best way you can.
You reminded me, I should have added, there's another social dimension to it. Once you do tag, if other people come along later and make any modifications, then the software automatically pushes those modifications to you as feedback.
Yeah.
And usually the modifications are acceptable or correct or improvements. But if they're not, you can always go back and undo what they did. But because you get this automated feedback, you know that people are reading your work, and you know, you get a reminder that, oh, that's a tag that I routinely forget, or I didn't realize there was a tag for such and such, and I'll start to use that in the future.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. We have a question from Joel Mitchell. He asks, how does OATP ensure that tags are semantically correct? Semantic as in semantic web.
Right. I'm glad you clarified that way. There are two kinds of semantic, and it's easier to answer for the other kind of semantic. One of the features we built into Tag Team was the ability to automate the process of changing a deprecated tag to an approved tag. In other words, to get the semantics or to get the controlled vocabulary exactly as we want. So for example, we have a tag for people. When there's a news story about a person working on open access, we use the tag OA.people. But a tagger wants to introduce the term OA.personnel. And not a bad tag, but all in all, people who are searching for works about people working on open access should search for one tag and not two tags. They shouldn't have to guess which is the right tag. So we pick the tag that we think is most appropriate. We deprecate the other ones, and we can write filters so that when somebody uses one of the deprecated tags, Tag Team automatically converts it to the approved tag. That's a feature that doesn't exist on any other tagging platform and that we badly wanted. I call this folksonomy and ontology out. And it really helps us preserve the integrity of the controlled vocabulary, or the semantics in that sense. Now, if you mean semantic in another sense, using triples or something for automated mining, no, we don't have that yet. On the other hand, the entire database is machine readable for somebody who wanted to do that. And the code is open.
Mm-hmm. And Christina Emery asks, can you give us some more information about how the feed is pushed out? For example, I've seen it on Twitter and on the OABN Slack channel. Are there other channels where it's available?
Yes, you might say that OATP has three native formats. There's RSS, Atom, and JSON. And anything that you can convert from RSS, let's say, is a potential new format. So one of the most popular formats for OATP is Twitter. And it doesn't push out in Twitter natively, but it pushes out in RSS, and there are tools for converting RSS to Twitter. And ditto, there are tools for converting RSS to email. And with these native formats plus these tools, you can convert to almost any other format. So our primary feed is available in 8 different file formats by default. That is, I've already done the work of converting to those other formats and then providing the links to them. But if somebody wanted to provide a link to a brand new format, or if a new format came out tomorrow, it's very likely that we could provide OATP feeds in that format because RSS and Atom and JSON are such flexible formats to begin with that somebody will write a tool to convert to that new format.
And Agatha was wondering, could you give us a sense of how many taggers are involved at this point? Do you know exactly how many active taggers there are?
I do, because you need permission to tag for OATP. And about 110 people have permission. And I would say 30 tag sporadically or more, and about 10 tag regularly. And that's enough to make it very, very comprehensive, but it's a far cry from the crowd that I really want one day. And so when Milica started, for example, we started to get coverage of OA news and comment in Croatian, for example, and we didn't have that before. There are lots of niches that we're not covering very well, and other niches that we cover very well. And the more taggers we have in more niches, the more comprehensive we'll be. So I definitely want to scale up from where we are.
Mm. And this may be a question, I don't know, more for Milica and Gary, but is there such a thing as a typical tagger, or do people all tend to have different backgrounds and interests? I mean, certainly, Milica, you were saying the number of different languages that you're able to cover. I imagine that's not particularly typical, although maybe it is.
It's about languages and it's about interest. These languages are not very difficult to cover for me because many of them are similar to my mother tongue. So that's not an issue. It's enough if you can read 2 or 3 languages passively. You don't have to speak them very well. And we now have Google Translate. It's about interests. For example, I know many people who usually say, I don't have time. And whatever you ask them, they don't have the time. So it's something that one can do during coffee breaks. For example, I usually do it on Saturday mornings, but I'm not very prepared to do anything more demanding. So it's about interests, about motivation. For example, I love the idea of crowdsourcing. I really like the idea, and I believe that it is probably one of the most interesting new things that the internet has enabled. So it's a great pleasure for me to get involved in such projects, because you do very little. One day, the other day, every day you do a little, and a new value is created through this. So this is probably the strongest motivation for me. Also, I usually spam people. I usually send them a lot of emails I'm a librarian, so I believe that the librarian's role is in connecting people and information. And sometimes people don't know whether there is an information that is interesting for them. So I used to spam people a lot, and now I see that some of them are not very happy about it. So OATP is a great thing to to spam someone who doesn't get angry because of that. So many things are involved.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to follow up on what Peter was saying about RSS and the different formats. I, for one, get the RSS feed for OATP delivered to me as an email. So every time there's a new entry, I'm using a service. There's 2 different services that I use. One is IFTTT, if this then that, which takes the RSS, reformats, and then sends it to my Gmail account. And there's another service out of the UK called Blogtrotter. And both of them, you just plug in the feed and out pops the email in your inbox. And I think they used to be free, but as many things, they start free and now are fee-based, but they're relatively inexpensive. And I think with Blogtrotter, if you plug in an RSS feed, start an account, I think if you don't mind having a little ad in the email, that remains free. But it's a great way of delivering it, not only to yourself, but I would also suggest, it was just mentioned, if you know somebody who's interested in a very small niche, you can actually create an RSS feed for them and deliver it directly to their inbox. So you help them set it up, you get it to their inbox. Now you're not spamming them, and it's all automated, really. And it's the power of the crowdsource on whatever that particular topic is, because as Peter mentioned, you can create a feed for any tag.
Mm. Yeah, and we have one actually on the side of the OABN blog, which just picks up the OA Books tag. So yeah, that feature is useful. With the email delivery, can you arrange to have a kind of roundup email of, say, the whole day's posts, or do you just have to have one separate email each time there's a new tag?
The default RSS to email tool that I use, it gives you a summary every day.
Right.
And
I believe with Blogtrotter, that's also, you can set it up to give it a summary every day or as they happen.
Yeah.
Right. And even though I read the feed online, which is another way to do it, HTML is one of our formats, I also subscribe to the email version of the feed, partly so that I have a backup of the entire database inside my email archive. So when I want to search for emails on a certain topic or using certain keywords, I pull up everything that's ever been tagged for OATP. And that's another benefit of the email format. As long as we're on that, I should mention the most popular unabridged format is the email format. Twitter is more popular, but it's abridged. And I'm sorry about that. I can't find an RSS to Twitter tool that doesn't abridge the feed. And if anybody can help me find one, I'd appreciate it.
So you mentioned earlier that the OATP is part of a bigger initiative, the Harvard Open Access Project, and you said you were hoping to get funding to develop some aspects of the OATP in the near future. And I was wondering, how does the relationship between those two entities work, and what sort of level of institutional support does the OATP get from Harvard?
The level of connection is loose. The Harvard Open Access Project was an umbrella project for several of my open access projects at the Berkman Center, and OATP was just one of them. And Tag Team, by the way, was another one of them. And for more than 10 years, I had funding to run those projects through the Berkman Center. And in 2018, I voluntarily let my grants expire because basically I was working half-time on those and half-time in Harvard Library. And I was really doing 2 full-time jobs instead of 2 half-time jobs. And I had to retreat to 1 full-time job. So OATP still runs. It's an all-volunteer project. It has been all-volunteer since 2018, and it's working at least as well. That is, we have at least as many new items tagged per day than we had in the days when I had grant-funded staffers. Although it's unfunded today, I'm thinking about applying for a new grant to fund it again. Well, I should actually put it another way. I've already applied for another grant to fund it again. It's too early to say what will become of it. But if it comes through, it will cover both the community management side of OATP, so we can recruit more taggers and train them, but also further development of Tag Team, the underlying software.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, because it's a crowdsourced project, and we've heard from Melissa and Gary about some of the different reasons that people like to tag for the project. Does it kind of go its own way, or is there a sense in which you're trying to drive it in any particular direction, Peter?
Again, I would call it loose. I do drive it because I, quote, own the hub inside Tag Team. I can control who becomes a tagger. So far, I've never had to deny anybody. I can expel people who spam things, and I've never had to expel anybody. I have the last word on the controlled vocabulary, but I've never had to overrule anybody. At some point, when I plan for my retirement or my death, I have to pass that on to somebody else. And I'm, by the way, looking for a person or a group to pass that on to, especially a group, because a group is more likely to survive than another individual. If it will continue, and I hope it will, then somebody or some group needs to take those responsibilities on themselves.
Mm-hmm. And on the topic of overruling people, Agata asks, she says she's half joking, do taggers ever get into fights over correct or incorrect tagging and their tags being corrected? I don't know if Melissa or Gary, this has ever happened to you.
No, it's a good question because I think about it now and then. We don't have edit wars the way Wikipedia does. Some of the items we tag are controversial. That is, sometimes they're very badly written or badly argued, but sometimes they're just contentious. But we all agree that we tag things that are badly written or contentious if they're relevant. And moreover, we only tag the things that we personally want to share. So if you think something is so bad that it's not worth sharing, don't tag it. And there's no problem with that. If somebody else chooses to tag it, that's fine. Again, the database just became more comprehensive. But there's never been a strong disagreement about tags. There's been discussion about which is the right kind of tag to use for a certain purpose. And every now and then I'll go on Twitter and I'll ask the crowd, I need a tag for such and such. How's this one? Or you see any drawbacks to this one? Here's an example. When there's OA-related news from the Arab world, I used to use the tag Arab world. And then an Egyptian tagger told me that's not the best tag for that purpose. And he proposed Arab. And by the way, I wouldn't have come up with that myself because I would have thought that was not quite right. But I trusted him, and that's the tag we now use for that purpose. And I do understand why Middle East is not the widely accepted tag for that purpose. So I try to find people who know something about the subject area or the region to advise on tags. And there's no reason why it couldn't become a community discussion before we settle on a tag. And there's also no reason why we can't change our minds. And Tag Team lets us do that. So if we have a tag for something and later we decide to change it, the software lets us change it prospectively and retroactively so that any use of the old tag automatically changes to the new one.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And what's the sort of biggest challenge facing the project, do you think, over the next, say, sort of 2 to 3 years or so, in a sort of short to medium term?
It's definitely recruiting more taggers. Again, we're not desperate because it's very comprehensive today, but we cover some niches better than others, as I've mentioned, and I want to cover all niches. And I want to be more comprehensive retroactively as well. So recruiting more taggers. So first, an appeal to everybody who's on the call today. Please consider becoming an OATP tagger yourself. There's a link in the chat at the very top on what that entails in case you want to take a closer look at it. But if you're already a tagger, like Melissa, and you have colleagues who might be interested in tagging as well, recommend it to them. If you know somebody who follows OA news in a certain niche, then if they tagged what they noticed, it's just a small addition to what they already do. And I think that is a good answer to your earlier question about a typical tagger. People who are already following OA news because of their work or because of their interests, simply decide, I'm going to tag what I noticed because it's a small addition to what I normally do. I'm not going to change my overall workload to spend hours a day doing something I did not normally do. But if I normally follow OA news, if it just happens to cross my desk, if it's in my inbox or in my Twitter feed, I'm just going to take a second to tag it.
Yeah. And I guess a couple of questions for all three of you at the end. Has the project or has being involved with it surprised you in any particular way? And if so, could you tell us how? Perhaps Gary, would you like to go first with that one?
Question. Let me continue to think about that one.
Sure, Melissa.
Surprised me? No, I can't say there's anything that's surprised me other than because working with Peter's always been a joy. But I don't have anything that, I'm also, one of the things I'm also specifically interested in is finding stories about open access where you might not normally find them. For example, the mainstream press, because I think it's really interesting to see how, while the community of taggers and even to some degree the library community, but open access and what it does is still not known by a lot of people. And I'm always looking for stories to see how it's starting to work its way into other areas. For example, if you're a high school student in January and February, and 5 months later you're a college student, I have found that a lot of most high school students I know to this point aren't aware of open access and what it means and how it, even as a high school student, could provide them with access to great material. So I'm also, not only am I doing my best to cover what I would call traditional sources, but I'm always looking for articles and lectures, whatever the case may be, where you might not normally find open access material, and then add those to the OATP.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, how about you?
Well, I usually get surprised because, when you're reading sources such as Wikipedia and something else, you always believe that there are many people who are doing this and that everything is already done. And I always get surprised when I find something that I would normally expect to be there, and it's not. So these are small surprises, but there are many. That's why I decided to go retroactively, and I have a lot of emails in my inbox that I should go through and tag some older news. I usually use a lot of alerts, among other things, Google Alerts. And Google Alerts usually capture things that are in the press or somewhere where you don't expect to find a piece of information. So I have quite many old Google Alerts that I should go through and pick up those things that surprise me by not being already there.
Christina's just noted, she says she finds Talkwalker Alerts, better than Google. Sometimes it's also free. So yeah, thanks, Christina.
I agree. There was a time when I used Google Alerts and Talkwalker Alerts to gather the news. And Google Alerts tend to err on the side of delivering not many results. In other words, they try to winnow it down for you. And Talkwalker Alerts seem to err on the other side and give you a large number. So if you use both at the same time, you get a pretty good sense of what's going on.
One of the tools that I use, I remember talking to Peter about this years ago, is a piece of software called Website Watcher. And this allows me, and anybody who uses it, to go to any level of any website, and when something on that page changes, it will alert me, not only by saying something has changed, but actually will highlight what on the page has changed. And this way, while there's thousands and thousands of stories, and press releases, often things never quote unquote make the press. And using a service like website, well, it's actually a piece of software called Website Watcher, you can quickly detect things that way before it might even make the press, if it does at all. So I'll put a link to it.
Gary introduced me to Website Watcher years ago, and I used it for many years. The problem is it took me almost all day to use it because I ended up asking it to track about 3,000 websites.
Yeah.
And it alerted me every day to all the changes on all of them. And most of them were not relevant to my work. So there was a lot of slogging through false positives. But it's very comprehensive, very speedy. And if you want to see whether a given page changes in any way, and if you want to see it immediately, it's the only tool I know of that does the job.
And Christina says, does that work on a domain level or for specific URLs? For
specific URLs. You can actually say, go 2 or 3 levels deep. You start running into thousands and thousands of pages. But it also will log you into a paywalled site and check as well, if that's something you want.
And you can even tell it, ignore changes of this kind or that kind.
Right. So you can ignore if it has this word or a timestamp. You can ignore all of that as well.
And then I suppose, is there anything in particular that you've learned thanks to the project that you wouldn't have known otherwise? I mean, I know the whole purpose of the OATP is to bring information to people's attention, but is there anything in particular that sort of sticks in your mind that you discovered thanks to the project?
Well, you might say it's confirmed what most of us already knew, which is that ordinary search engines aren't that useful for research because they deliver so many false positives. If you want to find something written on open access with a particular angle addressing certain subtopics, you can find it with Google. It might take you an hour. You can find it in OATP in minutes or less. And so having a specialized database, especially with a controlled vocabulary, is terribly useful. It's much more useful even than the best search engines.
Melissa?
Also, the ease of finding information that is relevant for my work, and also finding the old information. And also when you search for a particular tag and see the list in a chronological order, that gives the idea of how a concept developed. That's probably the greatest benefit for me that I find in working on this and on using OATP database.
Gary, how about you?
I don't have anything there, but I do want to mention one other comment about finding new material. Another tool that I use, I'm very fortunate here and to have access to a lot of what might be described as fee-based databases through my local public library. And most of the databases that I use there also have alert tools. So I can actually, I have alerts set up that if the word or the phrase, for example, open access publication is mentioned, I will get an alert that way. Then I can go ahead and find if it's available on the open web, find a link to it and then add it to OATP. So one of the things that a lot of people here in North America don't take advantage of are these fee-based databases that public libraries offer, and even more so that they don't take advantage of the alert tools that they provide. So that's one of the other ways that I can find material to add to the OATP.
Thank you. So are there any other questions from anybody in the audience? This is the last opportunity to either type them into the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask, you can do that. Doesn't look like we've got any more questions. Peter or Gary or Melitza, would any of you like to say? Oh, hang on. Toby just says, just a note that the filter oa.jobs is also very useful.
That's right. We have a tag for our jobs related to open access. And there's a feed for that. By the way, I'll put it in the chat. Partly so people have it, but partly so you can see the format of a URL for a specific tag. And so if you're looking for a job in the field of OA, just follow that particular tag. And it'll give you everything that our army of taggers has discovered, which is probably more than you would have discovered on your own.
And I have an impression that the most of those jobs are in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Like whenever I find a job, it's in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Well, there are two reasons for that. The Netherlands is very active in open access, and kudos to them. But also, we have some taggers who are Dutch, who do a good job of covering what's going on.
And I think as well, just to mention that I think Peter put that link on the OABN boards as well. We've got a jobs thread, and I think Peter, you linked that there. So check that out there. And have any of you got anything you would like to say just to finish off with, Peter or Gary or Melissa? Anything we didn't cover or that you'd like to reiterate? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much to all three of you, to Peter, to Gary and to Melissa, for taking the time to come and talk to us about the OATP. I certainly have a much better understanding of the project and how I might be able to contribute to it. So I hope that everyone else feels similarly. And thanks everyone for coming and for listening and for sending us some great questions and comments. This is really useful. We'll put out a recording of the session, and I'll try and add some of the links that have been mentioned as well, because there's quite a few useful links in the comments.
Very good. Again, thanks, Lucy, for organizing it. And thanks to all of you. I hope you enjoy using it. I hope you find it useful, but I also hope you consider tagging for it and making it useful for others.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I'll now close the session. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.